in this most desperate hour, I cannot, in good conscience, continue to mount a campaign that cannot win and which would interfere with the important work required of all of us in this difficult hour.
That was the live web announcement this morning. With that, the Sanders campaign is over. That means, as of this morning, a Wednesday in April, during a pandemic, former Vice President Joe Biden became the apparent nominee of the Democratic Party. Sanders said he would stay on the ballot in the remaining states and continue to gather delegates to impact the party platform, presumably to impact the convention, assuming it's in Milwaukee and not on Zoom. Back with us are James Carville and Michael Steele. So, James, what changed today? What should happen in the Democratic Party starting tomorrow? And what's this about staying on the ballot and continuing to roll up delegates?
Well, as you're pretty aware, I was not a fan of Senator Sanders' candidacy. I was not for him. However, every political professional, I mean, they had dreams. I mean, he ran and he and his wife had a dream, and the people that worked on the campaign, and it looked good for him for a while. And I kind of feel sorry for him in a way. It's like a soldier on the other side. You don't feel good about it to some extent. I mean, I'm really excited about Vice President Biden. And what has to happen tomorrow is and I think the Vice President's very good about this. We're going to have to do some old-time politicking and talk to Senator Sanders and talk to his supporters and talk about things that we can do to unify the party and get on with, I think, it's the single most important mission in modern American politics, and that is extracting Donald Trump as quickly as we can from the White House. And the way to do that is to unite the party, to be respectful for everybody, and understand that Senator Sanders, his wife Jane, his campaign, his supporters, his donors, that they had real dreams, they had aspirations, and that happens a lot in politics. But the decision is made. And by the way, it was Democratic voters that made the decision, and they made it overwhelmingly, and they have to be respected. It's not the establishment, or whatever that stupidity is, or it didn't make this voter. It was the rank and file of the Democratic Party that came in and did this.
Michael Steele, you've run a political party. If you were running the Democratic Party, would it bother you to have a guy who's out but kind of wants to see other people, is going to be on the ballot, wants to collect delegates if he can?
Well, it depends on how he moves in that space, Brian. If he's not creating any storms, if he's being supportive of the eventual nominee, and doing all the things to, as they say in biblical terms, as John the Baptist said of the coming of Christ, I shall diminish, he shall increase. Here we have a situation where Bernie Sanders has to diminish and Joe Biden has to increase. And that's the key thing right here that has to happen. He had the stage for a long time. If you go back to 2016, it has been a long time where Bernie Sanders not only has had the stage, but he has changed the way actors play on that stage inside the Democratic Party, adopting a lot of what he wanted in the platform, making rules changes with respect to delegates and superdelegates. So he has been in that spotlight. But now the party, to James's point, has made a very clear decision, the direction they want to go in and who they want to lead that direction. So he has to diminish. If he does not, then yes, as a chairman, up and down the line, from county all the way up to the national chairman, you will have to be concerned about that, because what that effectively does, Brian, is it doesn't release your supporters to get behind and move with the increase of the nominee.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.